Close your eyes and settle in. Tonight we walk through the life of Leon Scott Kennedy, a man whose first day on the job became a nightmare that never truly ended. From rookie cop to hardened government agent, his story is one of survival, duty, and the slow erosion of idealism in a world where bioterrorism never sleeps. This is the complete chronicle of Leon Kennedy, told in one unbroken narrative that flows like the fog through Raccoon City streets. Before the nightmare, Leon Scott Kennedy's story begins in tragedy long before he ever set foot in Raccoon City. His childhood was marked by violence and loss when his entire family was murdered in what appeared to be a crime connected to organized criminal activity. The specifics remain unclear, buried in police files and sealed records, but the outcome was absolute. Leon became an orphan before he could understand what that word truly meant, before he could build the kind of memories that anchor most people to their sense of home. In the aftermath of that violence, a single police officer stepped forward. This unnamed figure of authority saw a child who needed help and provided it, guiding Leon through the immediate crisis, and likely ensuring he ended up in appropriate care rather than lost in an overwhelmed system. That act of compassion planted a seed that would define everything that followed. Leon looked at this officer and saw what heroism could be, in its simplest, most meaningful form. One person choosing to help another when no one else would. That moment became Leon's compass. If one officer could change his life through simple decency and intervention, then perhaps he could do the same for others. It was a pure motivation, untainted by the complexities that would later define his career. Leon decided he would become a police officer, not for power or prestige, but because he understood firsthand how much that role could matter when executed with genuine care. He entered the police academy carrying that conviction and graduated at 21 years old with solid marks and a placement waiting for him at the Raccoon City Police Department. His instructors noted his determination and natural aptitude for the work, though some might have observed that his idealism was unusually intense, the kind that comes from personal stakes rather than abstract principle. Leon wasn't playing at being a hero. He genuinely believed in the possibility of making things better through dedicated service. In the days before his first shift, Leon received his assignment details and made preparations to relocate to Raccoon City. The town had a reputation as a quiet place, the kind of posting where a rookie could learn the fundamentals without being thrown into situations beyond his training. It seemed perfect, almost too good to be true. He packed his belongings, made arrangements for housing, and prepared mentally for the transition from academy student to active officer. Then came the phone call that nearly derailed everything. His girlfriend, whose name has been lost to the chaos that followed, ended their relationship just days before he was set to report for duty. The breakup hit harder than Leon expected, perhaps because it represented the last connection to his pre-career life, or perhaps simply because rejection hurts no matter how prepared you think you are for it. He dealt with the pain the way many young men do when their judgment fails them. He found a bottle and drank until the world softened at the edges. The hangover on September 28th was brutal, but Leon forced himself through the final preparations. He would leave the next morning, September 29th, 1998, and arrive in Raccoon City ready to begin his career. The irony of that drunken night would haunt him later. The poor decision that made him oversleep and arrive late for his first shift was the only reason he survived what came next. Sometimes the worst choices save your life, and you spend years trying to reconcile the guilt of surviving when those who made better decisions died screaming. September 29th, 1998. First day, last day. Leon's car rolled into Raccoon City on a night that felt wrong from the moment he crossed the city limits. The streets were too quiet, the kind of silence that makes you check your radio to see if it's working. A few fires burned in the distance, visible as orange glows against the darkness. But Leon's mind initially categorized them as accidents or isolated incidents rather than evidence of systemic collapse. He was hours late for his shift, focused on finding the police station and explaining his tardiness to whatever supervisor would be waiting with understandable irritation. The first body appeared in his headlights without warning. A figure crouched in the middle of the road, hunched over something. Leon slowed, his training kicking in with questions. Was this a medical emergency? An assault in progress? He called out, received no response, and approached carefully. The figure turned, and Leon's mind struggled to process what he was seeing. The person's face was wrong, skin gray and sloughing, eyes clouded and empty of anything resembling consciousness. Blood covered their mouth and hands, and between their fingers Leon could see what they'd been crouched over. Another body, this one being actively consumed. The creature lunged. Leon stumbled backward, hand moving instinctively toward the service weapon he'd been issued but hadn't yet fired outside a range. Before he could draw, the sound of a motorcycle engine cut through the night, and the creature's head snapped to the side, distracted. The motorcycle swerved around Leon, and he caught a glimpse of the rider, a young woman with short hair and determined eyes, someone else who clearly didn't belong in whatever nightmare Raccoon City had become. The woman on the motorcycle was Claire Redfield, and their first meeting consisted of shouted warnings and confused questions, exchanged at high speed, while more of the shambling creatures emerged from alleys and side streets. Claire was looking for her brother, Chris, an officer with the Special Tactics and Rescue Service who had stopped responding to her messages. Leon needed to reach the police department. Both objectives pointed in the same direction, so they agreed to head there together. They never made it as a pair. A burning truck jackknifed across the intersection just as they approached, flames erupting high enough to force them apart. Leon watched Claire disappear down a side street on her motorcycle while he was forced in the opposite direction on foot, already surrounded by more of the creatures. These were zombies, though Leon didn't have that word yet, didn't have any framework for understanding how the recently dead could rise and hunt the living with such persistence. The next hours blurred into a desperate fight for survival. Leon made his way through abandoned streets, discovering that the creatures were slow but relentless, that headshots dropped them permanently while body shots merely slowed them down, that the entire city had become a tomb where the dead refused to stay buried. He found other survivors, some of them officers from the department he'd never officially reported to, most of them too traumatized or injured to be much help. He gathered weapons, ammunition, first aid supplies, anything that might keep him alive long enough to find answers. When he finally reached the Raccoon City Police Department, the building looked like it had been under siege. The main entrance was barricaded, bodies littered the front steps, and the few lights still functioning revealed a scene of carnage that suggested the defenders had lost their battle hours ago. Leon forced entry through a side door and found himself in corridors that had become charnel houses. Officers he would have worked alongside lay dead or transformed into the same creatures that prowled the streets outside. The place that should have represented safety and order had fallen just as completely as everywhere else. Inside the station, Leon's training finally found purchase. The building was a three-dimensional puzzle filled with locked doors, hidden keys, and survivors trapped in various rooms waiting for rescue or death. He moved methodically, clearing areas, searching for supplies and information about what had caused this catastrophe. Documents scattered throughout the building painted a disturbing picture. The Umbrella Corporation, a a pharmaceutical company with facilities in and around Raccoon City, had been conducting illegal bioweapons research. Something had gone catastrophically wrong, and the result was a virus called T-virus that reanimated dead tissue and turned living humans into mindless cannibals. It was in the police station that Leon encountered Ada Wong. She appeared suddenly in a hallway, dressed impractically for a zombie outbreak in a red dress and heels, claiming to be an FBI agent investigating Umbrella's activities. She was looking for her boyfriend, a researcher named Ben Bertolucci, and needed Leon's help accessing restricted areas of the station. Something about her story felt off. Federal agents didn't typically conduct investigations alone in evening wear, but Leon was desperate for any ally who seemed competent, and Ada moved through the chaos with a confidence that suggested genuine training. Their partnership formed quickly, born from necessity, and the simple fact that two people survived better than one in this environment. Ada was searching for information about the G virus, a new bioweapon even more dangerous than the T virus that had destroyed Raccoon City. Leon helped her access the underground areas beneath the police station, fighting through corridors that led to Umbrella's secret research facility. It was there, in sterile laboratories built beneath the city, that the full scope of Umbrella's crimes became clear. The G virus had been developed by William Birkin, a brilliant scientist who had been murdered by Umbrella's own security forces when the corporation decided to seize his research without compensation. In his final moments, Birkin had injected himself with the G virus, transforming into a massive, constantly mutating monstrosity that now hunted through the facility with animal cunning and superhuman strength. His daughter, Sherry Birkin, was somewhere in the facility, and both Leon and Ada's paths became entangled with finding and protecting the child. In the laboratory's depths, Leon encountered Annette Birkin, William's widow and fellow researcher. She revealed that Ada wasn't FBI at all, but a mercenary sent to steal a sample of the G virus for an unknown employer. The betrayal stung more than Leon wanted to admit. He'd trusted Ada, had begun to feel something for her beyond simple partnership, and now discovered she'd been manipulating him from their first meeting. When Ada didn't deny the accusation, simply acknowledged it with the kind of professional detachment that made clear she'd done this many times before, something in Leon's worldview cracked. The confrontation between Ada and Annette escalated into violence. Gunfire echoed through the laboratory as the two women exchanged shots, each trying to secure or protect the G virus sample. In the chaos, Ada was hit, stumbling backward toward a platform edge. Leon lunged to catch her, but was too slow. He watched her fall into the darkness below, her body disappearing into shadows too deep to penetrate. There was no time to search for her, no time to confirm whether she'd survived, because the facility's self-destruct sequence had been activated and he still needed to find Claire and Sherry. Leon reunited with Claire and Sherry in the facility's lower levels, all three of them battling exhaustion and injuries while searching for an escape route. William Birkin's mutated form pursued them relentlessly, the creature that had once been a loving father now reduced to base instinct and rage. They fought him multiple times, each encounter revealing new mutations and adaptations, the G virus continuously reshaping his body into more efficient killing forms. The final confrontation came on a train platform deep beneath the city. William Birkin, now barely recognizable as anything that had once been human, blocked their escape with the kind of determination that suggested some vestige of human will still directed the monstrosity. Leon and Claire fought together, combining their remaining ammunition and weapons into a desperate final assault. When Birkin finally fell, his body collapsing onto the tracks, They had seconds to board the train and activate its emergency departure. As the train accelerated toward the surface, carrying them away from the self-destructing facility, one final horror emerged. A tyrant, one of Umbrella's most advanced bioorganic weapons, crashed through the train car's roof. The T-103 model was designed to be the perfect soldier, intelligent enough to follow complex orders but completely loyal, strong enough to tear through reinforced barriers, and resilient enough to survive damage that would kill any normal creature. It had been pursuing them since the police station, directed by programming to eliminate witnesses to Umbrella's crimes. The fight should have been impossible. Leon and Claire were out of ammunition, exhausted, wounded, and trapped in a moving train car with something designed to be unkillable. But Ada Wong appeared one final time, very much alive, tossing a rocket launcher down from above before disappearing again. Leon caught the weapon, aimed at the tyrant as it advanced, and fired. The explosion in such a confined space was deafening, but when Leon's vision cleared, the tyrant was gone, blown apart by the point-blank hit. The train emerged into dawn light, carrying 3 survivors out of a city that was already being written off by authorities. Leon, Claire, and Sherry stumbled out at a station miles from Raccoon City's limits, alive but irrevocably changed. Behind them, the city continued its death throes, fires spreading block by block. Within hours, the decision would be made at the highest levels of government to sterilize the entire area with a nuclear strike, erasing the evidence of Umbrella's crimes, along with any remaining survivors who hadn't managed to escape. The aftermath and recruitment. The immediate aftermath of Raccoon City was bureaucratic nightmare disguised as rescue and debriefing. Leon, Claire, and Sherry were separated almost immediately, taken to different facilities for medical treatment, psychological evaluation, and interrogation. The government wanted to know what they'd seen, what evidence they'd encountered, and most importantly, what they might say publicly about the disaster. Umbrella Corporation had powerful friends in multiple agencies and industries, and the truth about what had really happened in Raccoon City was politically inconvenient. Leon spent weeks in a facility that was part hospital and part detention center, being treated for his injuries while government officials tried to determine how much of a problem he represented. He'd seen too much, understood too clearly that Umbrella's bioweapons research had been conducted with government knowledge, if not outright support, and his idealism made him the kind of person who might insist on accountability. The officials who interviewed him spoke carefully, asking questions designed to assess whether Leon Kennedy, the rookie cop, would become a whistleblower or a liability that needed to be managed more permanently. It was during this period that Leon learned the full extent of what he'd stepped into. Raccoon City hadn't been Umbrella's first disaster, merely their most public one. The Arklay Mountains incident that had occurred earlier that year, investigated by Chris Redfield and other STARS members, had been covered up successfully. Similar outbreaks in other locations had been contained before the public noticed. Umbrella's bioweapons program had been operating for decades, selling their products to militaries and terrorists worldwide, and the T-virus was just one product in an extensive catalog of horrors. The government's solution to the Leon Kennedy problem arrived in the form of a simple ultimatum delivered by men in suits who didn't bother introducing themselves. Leon would be recruited into a newly formed anti-bioterrorism unit operating under direct presidential authority. He would receive training, resources, and missions targeting Umbrella's remaining facilities and any other bioweapon threats that emerged. In exchange, he would remain silent about certain aspects of what he'd witnessed in Raccoon City, and Sherry Birkin would be placed in protective custody, rather than being turned over to whatever remained of Umbrella's research division, which had shown intense interest in the girl who carried G-virus antibodies in her blood. It wasn't a choice. Not really. Leon could accept the offer and at least continue fighting against the bioterror threat with official backing. Or he could refuse and watch Sherry disappear into a system that would treat her as a test subject rather than a child who needed protection. The idealistic rookie who had driven into Raccoon City, wanting to help people, would have refused on principle, would have demanded justice and transparency. The man who had survived the outbreak understood that idealism was a luxury he could no longer afford. He accepted. The training that followed was comprehensive and brutal. Leon was already in decent physical condition from the police academy, but the program he entered operated at a different level entirely. Close quarters combat, advanced weapons handling, tactical operations, intelligence gathering, survival skills for every environment. Leon absorbed it all with the focus of someone who had seen what happened when you weren't prepared for the worst. His instructors noted that he learned quickly, adapted well to changing scenarios, and maintained effectiveness under pressure. What they couldn't measure was the cost. Leon was being transformed from a person who wanted to protect people into a weapon pointed at threats most people didn't know existed. During this period, Leon maintained limited contact with Claire, who had her own battles to fight. She'd gone searching for Chris and gotten caught up in Umbrella's operations on Rockford Island, an experience that left her as scarred as Leon's Raccoon City nightmare. They understood each other in ways that normal people couldn't, bonded by shared trauma and the knowledge that the world was far more dangerous than civilians suspected. But their paths were diverging. Claire wasn't interested in becoming a government operative. She'd eventually align with human rights organizations fighting against bioweapon proliferation through different channels. Sherry remained in government custody, technically protected, but effectively imprisoned for her own safety and for the research value her unique antibodies represented. Leon checked on her when he could, using what limited access his position allowed. She was being educated, cared for physically, but growing up in a gilded cage that would shape her into someone very different from the frightened child Leon had helped rescue. The guilt of that arrangement sat heavy, but there were no better options available. At least she was alive, which was more than could be said for most people who'd been in Raccoon City that night. By the year 2000, Leon Kennedy had been remade. The rookie cop was gone, replaced by a government agent with classified clearance and a mission portfolio that took him to locations that officially didn't exist to deal with threats that officially hadn't occurred. His first assignments were reconnaissance and cleanup, tracking down Umbrella assets, investigating suspected bioweapon development sites, and occasionally extracting researchers who wanted to defect. He was good at the work, efficient and thorough, but something fundamental had changed in how he approached it. The idealism was still there, buried deep, but it was now wrapped in layers of pragmatism and the understanding that saving everyone wasn't possible. Sometimes you just tried to minimize the casualties. Operation Javier, South American Nightmare, 2002. Leon's first major mission as a government agent came in 2002 when intelligence reports indicated that a South American drug lord named Javier Hidalgo had begun deploying bioweapons in the Amazon rainforest region. Javier ran a criminal empire built on drug trafficking, human trafficking, and political corruption, controlling a territory where government authority barely reached. Recently, his operations had taken a disturbing turn. Villages in his territory were being attacked by creatures that survivors described as impossibly strong and resistant to conventional weapons. The pattern was familiar to anyone who'd studied bioweapon deployment, and the U.S. government wanted Leon to investigate. For this mission, Leon was partnered with Jack Krauser, a former Army Special Forces operator who had been recruited into the same anti-bioterror unit through different channels. Krauser had an impressive military record, multiple tours in conflict zones, specialized training in counterinsurgency and jungle warfare, and a reputation for getting results through aggressive tactics. On paper, he was exactly the kind of partner Leon needed for a mission deep in hostile territory. In practice, the two men had fundamentally different philosophies about their work. Krauser saw the mission in purely strategic terms. Infiltrate Javier's territory, confirm the bioweapon presence, eliminate the threat, and extract. Collateral damage was acceptable if it achieved the objective. Leon, despite years of government training, still held on to the belief that protecting civilians mattered, even when it complicated the mission. This tension would define their partnership throughout Operation Javier, with Krauser growing increasingly frustrated with what he saw as Leon's sentimentality, and Leon disturbed by Krauser's willingness to prioritize objectives over lives. They inserted into the region during the rainy season, when the rivers ran high and the jungle canopy was thick enough to obscure aerial surveillance. Intelligence had provided approximate coordinates for Javier's main compound, but the territory between their insertion point and the target was unmapped and hostile. The first village they reached had been abandoned recently, meals left half-eaten and fires still warm. Something had driven the inhabitants away in a hurry, and Leon's instincts, honed in Raccoon City, told him they needed to find out what before pushing deeper into Javier's territory. The answer came at dusk when the creatures emerged from the jungle. They resembled humans in basic shape, but moved with disturbing fluidity, their bodies enhanced with what appeared to be T-virus mutations. These weren't the shambling zombies Leon had fought in Raccoon City, but something faster and more coordinated, retaining enough cognitive function to use tactics and weapons. Krauser engaged without hesitation, his military training evident in how efficiently he eliminated targets. Leon fought alongside him but couldn't shake the recognition that these creatures had been people recently, probably locals who'd had the misfortune of being in Javier's territory when he decided to test his new weapons. As they penetrated deeper into the region, the situation became clearer. Javier Hidalgo had obtained samples of the T-virus, likely from former Umbrella personnel selling off assets as the corporation collapsed under international pressure following Raccoon City's destruction. He'd been using the virus to maintain control over his territory, turning disobedient subordinates and rival faction members into bioweapons that served both as punishment and demonstration of power. But intelligence also suggested something else. Javier's daughter, Manuela, was sick with an incurable disease, and her father's desperation to save her had driven him to even more extreme experiments with bioweapon research. They encountered Manuela in Javier's compound, a young woman in her late teens who should have been dying from her illness but instead showed signs of active viral infection. Javier had infected his own daughter with a modified virus in an attempt to cure her disease, and while the virus had indeed arrested the original illness, it was slowly transforming her into something inhuman. She was lucid, aware of what was happening to her, and terrified of what she was becoming. Her father saw only that she was alive, calling it a miracle of science, and refusing to acknowledge the horror he'd inflicted. The moral complexity of the situation troubled Leon in ways that Krauser dismissed as irrelevant. Yes, Manuela was infected with a bioweapon. Yes, she represented a potential threat if the infection progressed. But she was also a victim of her father's crimes, and Leon couldn't shake the parallel to Sherry Birkin, another child who'd been caught up in her parents' bioweapon research through no fault of her own. He advocated for bringing Manuela out alive, getting her proper medical treatment, giving her a chance. Krauser argued for the clean solution. Eliminate all bioweapon threats, including Manuela, burn the compound, and ensure nothing survived to spread infection. The decision was taken out of their hands when Javier, confronted with the realization that his empire was collapsing and foreign operatives were in his compound, injected himself with a massive dose of his most advanced viral samples. The transformation was rapid and grotesque, his body expanding and mutating into something that barely retained human configuration. Javier had become the very thing he'd been deploying as a weapon, and now he was using his new form to try to kill everyone in the compound, including his own daughter. The battle against mutated Javier pushed both Leon and Krauser to their limits. The creature that had been the drug lord could regenerate damage faster than they could inflict it, had developed biological weapons integrated into its body, and fought with the kind of desperate fury that comes from having nothing left to lose. They expended most of their ammunition and explosives just slowing it down, and the fight ranged through the compound, destroying buildings and killing many of Javier's remaining subordinates who got caught in the crossfire. Manuela made the decision that neither Leon nor Krauser had been willing to commit to. She used her own viral infection, which had given her limited control over organic matter, to attack her father's mutated form from within. The effort was burning through her life force, killing her in the process of killing him, but she did it anyway, choosing to end the nightmare her father had created, even if it meant ending herself. Leon tried to stop her, tried to find another way, but Manuela was resolute. She'd seen what her father had become, what she herself was becoming, and she made the choice to ensure no one else would suffer from Javier's bioweapon experiments. When Javier's mutated form finally collapsed, destroyed from within by his daughter's sacrifice, Leon and Krauser escaped the compound with Manuela's body. She died in Leon's arms, asking him to remember that she tried to do the right thing in the end. The mission was technically successful. Javier Hidalgo was dead, his bioweapon stockpiles were destroyed, and the threat was eliminated. But Leon returned from Operation Javier changed in ways that his debriefing officers noticed but couldn't quite quantify. Krauser's assessment was different. He'd watched Leon hesitate, seen him prioritize civilians and infected victims over operational efficiency, and concluded that Leon Kennedy was too soft for the kind of work their unit required. Krauser requested reassignment and was placed on medical leave shortly after Operation Javier when an injury from the mission failed to heal properly. The two men parted ways with mutual professional respect, but no personal warmth. Each convinced the other had the wrong approach to fighting bioterrorism. It would be years before they encountered each other again, under circumstances neither could have predicted. For Leon, Operation Javier reinforced lessons that Raccoon City had first taught him. Bioweapons destroyed everything they touched. The people who created them always believed they could control the outcome, and they were always wrong. Innocent people died in numbers too large to fully count, and sometimes the only victory available was making sure the disaster didn't spread beyond its current boundaries. Those lessons would serve him well in the mission that would define his reputation and prove that he'd become one of the most effective agents in the government's anti-bioterror arsenal. Resident Evil 4, The Spanish Village, 2004. In 2004, Leon Kennedy received orders for his most high-profile mission to date. Ashley Graham, the president's daughter, had been kidnapped while returning from university in Massachusetts. Intelligence suggested she'd been taken to a remote region in rural Spain by an organization that had no apparent political demands or ransom requests. The Secret Service and FBI were handling the investigation through official channels, but the president wanted someone with specific experience in unconventional threats to lead a parallel investigation. Leon's record made him the obvious choice. The mission briefing was deliberately vague about why bioterrorism specialists were being deployed to what appeared to be a straightforward kidnapping. Leon pushed for more information and was told that intelligence indicated the kidnappers might be connected to a religious cult called Los Illuminados that had been flagged in reports about unusual activities in the region. The cult's leader, Osman Sadler, had been purchasing biological research materials through black market channels, and there were concerns that Ashley's kidnapping might be connected to bioweapon research rather than conventional criminal motives. Leon inserted into Spain alone, traveling under diplomatic cover to a small village in the mountains where Ashley had last been tracked. The official Spanish authorities had been notified that an American agent would be operating in their territory, but were told it was a kidnapping recovery, not a potential bioterror incident. Leon carried standard armament for the region, a pistol, combat knife, and communication equipment that would let him call for extraction once he'd secured Ashley. The assumption was that this would be a quick operation. Locate the girl, neutralize any resistance, and get out before the situation escalated. The first indication that something was deeply wrong came when Leon reached the village and was immediately attacked by locals with farming tools. These weren't professional kidnappers or security forces, but ordinary villagers who moved with disturbing coordination and expressed hostility that went beyond normal wariness of outsiders. When Leon defended himself, dropping several attackers, he realized they weren't staying down. Injuries that should have been incapacitating barely slowed them, and their behavior suggested something neurologically wrong, some kind of drugging or conditioning that overrode normal human responses to pain and danger. He fought his way through the village, searching for any sign of Ashley or indication of where she might be held. The locals attacked in waves, using numbers and environmental advantages to compensate for Leon's superior training and equipment. Unlike the zombies in Raccoon City, these people were fast, could use weapons and tools effectively, and coordinated their attacks with tactical awareness. They were infected with something, Leon was certain, but it wasn't the T-virus he'd encountered before. This was different, something that left hosts with their cognitive abilities intact while subverting their will. In a village house, Leon found evidence that confirmed his worst suspicions. Documents referencing Las Plagas, parasites that had been discovered in the region and were being cultivated by Los Illuminados. The parasites could be implanted in human hosts, growing throughout their bodies and eventually allowing the cult to control their behavior. The entire village population had been infected, turned into thralls serving Los Illuminados' purposes. Ashley wasn't being held for ransom. She'd been brought here to be infected with a plaga, turned into a weapon that could be sent back to the United States with access to the highest levels of government. Leon's mission parameters shifted immediately. This wasn't a rescue operation anymore. It was a bioterrorism incident that required containment and elimination of the threat. He radioed for support and was told that backup would take time to arrange given the remote location and political sensitivities of operating in Spain without full governmental approval. Until extraction could be arranged, Leon would need to locate Ashley, prevent her from being infected if possible, and survive in hostile territory where every civilian was a potential enemy. He found Ashley in a church that Los Illuminados had converted into a holding facility. She was alive, unharmed, and already infected. Lord Sadler, the cult's leader, had personally overseen her infection, implanting a plaga that would take several days to fully mature. Once it did, Ashley would lose her free will completely, becoming a puppet that Sadler could control remotely. She'd be returned to her father, placed back into her normal life, and wait until Sadler activated the plaga and turned the president's daughter into his instrument for infiltrating or destroying the U.S. government. Ashley was terrified but holding together, and Leon immediately shifted into protective mode. He'd get her out, find a way to remove the plaga before it matured, and prevent Los Illuminados from completing their plan. The complication was that during the initial village attack, Leon had been ambushed and knocked unconscious long enough for the cultists to inject him with a plaga as well. Both he and Ashley were infected, on a countdown until the parasites matured and Sadler could take control of them both. The mission had become personal in the most immediate way possible. Their escape from the church triggered a pursuit that would span the entire region. Los Illuminados wasn't just a village cult, but an organization that controlled significant territory and resources. Sadler commanded not just infected villagers, but also 3 powerful lieutenants he called his castellans. Ramon Salazar, a deranged aristocrat who controlled a castle filled with bioweapon experiments. Vitores Mendez, the village chief whose plaga infection had transformed him into a creature of immense strength, and a mysterious figure in tactical gear who operated with military precision and seemed personally invested in ensuring Leon failed. Leon and Ashley fought through the village, across the lake, and into Salazar's castle, a medieval structure that the young aristocrat had converted into a laboratory and prison. The castle was filled with horrors, plaga-infected humans in various stages of mutation, bioweapon experiments that had been ongoing since before Sadler took control of the cult, and traps designed to capture or kill anyone trying to navigate its corridors. Salazar himself appeared periodically, taunting Leon through speaker systems and sending waves of infected at them, treating the entire situation as entertainment. It was in the castle that Leon encountered Luis Serra, a researcher who'd been working for Los Illuminados, but had grown horrified by what the cult was doing with his research. Luis was a complicated ally, charming, intelligent, guilt-ridden about his role in developing the plaga cultivation process, and desperate to make amends by helping Leon and Ashley escape. He revealed that he'd been working on a method to remove plagas before they fully matured, a drug that could kill the parasite without killing the host. The research was almost complete, but the samples and equipment were scattered across the region, and Luis would need time to synthesize enough for both Leon and Ashley. Working with Luis provided Leon with his first real advantage in the mission. Luis knew Los Illuminados' operations intimately, understood the plaga's biology, and could guide them to resources and weapons that might even the odds. But Luis's defection hadn't gone unnoticed. Sadler dispatched his forces to hunt down the traitor, and the mysterious figure in tactical gear made Luis a personal priority. During one encounter, as Luis was preparing to hand over the first plaga removal samples, he was attacked and fatally wounded. The mysterious figure removed his mask as Luis died, revealing himself to be Jack Krauser. Leon's former partner from Operation Javier had somehow survived what was supposed to be a career-ending injury and was now working for Los Illuminados, functioning as Sadler's enforcer and the one responsible for originally kidnapping Ashley. The betrayal cut deep. Krauser had been a difficult partner but always a professional. Seeing him actively working for a bioterror organization suggested either coercion or a corruption that Leon hadn't seen coming. Krauser's presence escalated everything. He was as skilled as Leon, more ruthless, and enhanced by something that gave him inhuman abilities. His left arm could transform into a massive, blade-like appendage that suggested plaga infection, but far more advanced than what the villagers demonstrated. During their first direct confrontation, Krauser dominated the fight, forcing Leon into pure survival mode. Only Ashley's intervention, using resources in the environment to create distractions, allowed Leon to escape and continue deeper into the castle. Luis died, passing the plaga removal samples to Leon, making him promise to save Ashley and stop Sadler. The drugs worked, killing Leon's plaga before it could mature, but there was only enough for one dose. Ashley would need to wait until Leon could find Luis's laboratory and synthesize more, assuming the equipment still existed and he could figure out the process. The weight of that responsibility, that he'd been saved while Ashley remained infected, drove Leon forward with renewed intensity. They fought through Ramon Salazar's forces, eventually confronting the young Castellan directly. Salazar, infected with a specialized plaga that gave him limited telepathic control over other infected, had transformed his own body into something monstrous in an attempt to kill Leon personally. The battle took place in a ritual chamber deep in the castle, with Salazar's mutated form growing to massive proportions as it absorbed biomass from the environment. Leon destroyed him using a combination of conventional weapons and improvised explosives, bringing down part of the castle in the process. With Salazar dead and the castle collapsing, Leon and Ashley escaped to an island facility where Los Illuminados conducted their most advanced research. This was where Sadler had been developing military applications for the plagas, creating bioweapons that could be sold to the highest bidder. The facility held documentation of Sadler's true plan. He intended to use plaga-infected agents to infiltrate governments worldwide, creating a network of controlled individuals in positions of power. Ashley was just the first step, a proof of concept that would open doors to more ambitious operations. The island facility was also where Leon finally confronted Krauser directly. His former partner had been ordered to kill Leon and recapture Ashley, but there was personal animosity driving Krauser beyond just following orders. He'd grown to resent Leon during Operation Javier, seeing him as weak and sentimental, and wanted to prove his own philosophy about strength and ruthlessness was superior. Their battle ranged across the facility's exterior, Krauser using his enhanced abilities, and Leon relying on tactics and adaptability. Leon prevailed, though he took significant injuries in the process. As Krauser died, he revealed fragments of how he'd ended up working for Los Illuminados. After Operation Javier, his injury had ended his military career, and he'd been recruited by someone promising power and purpose. That someone was Albert Wesker, a name Leon recognized from reports about Umbrella Corporation's collapse. Wesker had been a high-ranking Umbrella operative who'd survived the corporation's destruction and was now operating independently, gathering bioweapon samples and research for unknown purposes. Krauser had been working for Wesker, and Wesker had placed him inside Los Illuminados to monitor and eventually steal their plaga research. This revelation added another layer to the mission. Leon wasn't just fighting a cult. He was caught in a larger game involving remnants of Umbrella's bioweapons network. Wesker's involvement meant that even if Leon succeeded in stopping Sadler, the plagas might still end up in circulation. The thought was exhausting. Another reminder that bioterrorism wasn't a problem you solved once, but a continuous battle against people who saw living weapons as profitable commodities. Leon found Luis's laboratory and synthesized the plaga removal drug for Ashley, successfully treating her infection. With both of them clear of parasitic control, the mission became simpler. Escape the island and ensure Sadler couldn't use Los Illuminados' resources to continue his plans. But Sadler wasn't going to let them leave without a final confrontation. He'd injected himself with a master plaga, something that gave him control over all other infected while transforming his own body into a walking bioweapon. The final battle against Sadler pushed Leon beyond anything he'd faced before. The cult leader's transformed state made him nearly invulnerable to conventional damage, and he could summon infected subordinates as reinforcements. The fight ranged through the ritual chamber at the island's center, Leon exhausting his ammunition and weapons trying to find a weakness in Sadler's defenses. He was on the verge of being overwhelmed when Ada Wong appeared, just as she had in Raccoon City, throwing him a specialized weapon. Ada's presence raised questions Leon didn't have time to address. She was working for Wesker, obviously, sent to secure the plaga sample that Krauser had failed to retrieve. But she helped Leon kill Sadler rather than simply taking what she wanted and leaving him to die. Whatever her orders were, she'd made a choice to assist him, and that choice saved his life. Sadler's mutated form collapsed, and Ada used the opportunity to secure a plaga sample before disappearing, warning Leon to leave immediately because the island's self-destruct had been activated. Leon and Ashley escaped on a jet ski as explosions tore through the island facility, destroying Los Illuminados' research and any remaining infected. They rendezvoused with extraction forces miles offshore, both exhausted and injured, but alive. The mission was successful by any objective measure. Ashley was rescued, the plaga threat was eliminated, and Los Illuminados was destroyed. But Leon knew the larger battle was far from over. Ada had secured a sample for Wesker, which meant the plagas would eventually surface again in someone else's bioweapon program. The aftermath of the Spanish Village mission elevated Leon's profile within the government. He'd successfully rescued the president's daughter under impossible circumstances, demonstrated exceptional combat effectiveness, and contained a bioterror threat that could have had global implications. President Graham personally thanked Leon and made it clear that he now had a direct line to the highest levels of government for future operations. Leon had become one of the most trusted assets in the fight against bioterrorism, a reputation that would define the rest of his career. Degeneration, Will Pharma Incident, 2005. The year after the Spanish Village incident, Leon was dispatched to investigate a bioterror attack at Harvardville Airport. A T-virus outbreak had occurred in the terminal, transforming dozens of civilians into zombies and creating a hostage situation that local authorities couldn't handle. Leon's assignment was to infiltrate the airport, assess the situation, and neutralize the threat while federal teams established a perimeter to prevent the outbreak from spreading beyond the facility. The airport incident seemed straightforward at first, a tragic case of terrorism using biological weapons that Umbrella had developed, but as Leon fought through the infected terminal, rescuing survivors and searching for the outbreak's source, complications emerged. One of the survivors was Claire Redfield, who'd been at the airport for a meeting with TerraSave, the human rights organization she now worked with. Their reunion in the midst of another zombie outbreak was grimly ironic, a reminder that their lives had been permanently shaped by Raccoon City. Working together again, Leon and Claire uncovered that the attack was more complex than simple terrorism. A pharmaceutical company called Will Pharma had been developing a T-virus vaccine using samples that should have been destroyed after Raccoon City. One of their researchers, motivated by a combination of revenge and greed, had stolen viral samples and released them in the airport to create a crisis that would drive up demand for Will Pharma's vaccine. The attack was engineered not just to kill people, but to manipulate stock prices and pharmaceutical policy. The cynicism of using bioterrorism for financial profit disgusted Leon in ways that even Sadler's cult hadn't. At least Los Illuminados believed in something, however twisted. The Will Pharma incident was pure greed dressed up as tragedy, and the people dying in the airport were just props in someone's scheme to get wealthy. Leon's approach to the mission reflected his anger, moving with an efficiency that bordered on ruthless as he eliminated infected and traced the attack back to its source. The operation expanded when a new bioweapon, the G virus strain that had transformed William Birkin in Raccoon City, appeared in the airport. Someone had released not just T virus but also G virus samples, creating an escalating crisis that threatened to overwhelm containment efforts. Leon faced multiple bioweapon entities while also trying to keep civilians alive and evacuate survivors through secure corridors. The mission lasted hours, pushing Leon's endurance and resources to their limits. By the time the airport was secured, dozens were dead and the facility was rendered unusable, needing complete decontamination. The researcher responsible for the attack was arrested. Will Pharma's illegal vaccine program was exposed, and measures were put in place to prevent similar incidents. But Leon walked away from the operation more disillusioned than before. Raccoon City was supposed to have ended this. The T virus was supposed to be gone, but here it was again, being used by people who saw bioweapons as tools for personal advancement. Claire noticed the change in Leon during their brief reunion. The optimistic rookie she'd met in Raccoon City was gone, replaced by someone harder and more cynical. They spoke briefly about what they'd each been doing in the years since their first meeting, and Leon couldn't hide the exhaustion in his voice when he described the endless cycle of bioterror incidents. Claire worked to prevent these situations through policy and advocacy. Leon cleaned up after them with weapons and body counts. Both approaches were necessary, but only Leon's resulted in nightmares. Infinite Darkness, Government Conspiracy, 2006. In 2006, Leon was assigned to security detail at the White House when a cyber attack compromised the facility's systems. During the chaos, zombies appeared in the building itself, creating a crisis that suggested someone had deliberately targeted the president with a bioterror attack. Leon responded immediately, protecting President Graham and eliminating the infected, while security forces evacuated key personnel. The incident appeared to be an isolated attack, until Leon discovered classified documents suggesting the outbreak was connected to a military operation in Penamstan, a conflict zone where U.S. forces had been deployed. The documents referenced bioweapons being used in the conflict, and a conspiracy within the government to cover up the deployment. Leon's investigation led him to a senator who had been using bioweapon incidents to manipulate foreign policy, deliberately creating crises that justified military intervention and increased defense spending. This mission was different from Leon's previous operations because the threat came from within the government he served. The bioterror attack on the White House wasn't foreign terrorism, but domestic conspiracy. Powerful people using the very weapons Leon was fighting to eliminate as tools for their own political agendas. The moral complexity of the situation tested Leon's loyalty to his position and forced him to make choices about how far he was willing to go to expose the truth. He partnered with federal agent Shen Mei, who had her own reasons for investigating the conspiracy, and together they uncovered a plot that extended beyond just one senator. Military contractors, intelligence officials, and politicians had created a network that profited from bioweapon deployment, treating outbreaks as business opportunities. Leon gathered evidence while fighting through facilities where bioweapons were being researched and tested, encountering creatures that had been specifically designed for military applications. The investigation culminated in a confrontation with the senator and his bioweapon assets in a facility hidden within U.S. territory. Leon successfully stopped the immediate threat and gathered enough evidence to expose the conspiracy. But political considerations prevented full disclosure. The president couldn't publicly reveal that elements of his own government had been deploying bioweapons without triggering an international crisis. The evidence was sealed, the conspirators were quietly removed from power, and the truth was buried to protect national security. This outcome broke something in Leon. He'd risked his life to expose corruption and prevent future bioweapon deployments, only to watch the evidence disappear into classified archives. The people responsible faced consequences, but the public would never know what had almost happened, and similar conspiracies could emerge again because the full scope of the threat was never revealed. Leon completed his mission but came away questioning whether his work actually mattered, if the truth could be suppressed whenever it became inconvenient. His interaction with Claire Redfield during this period was strained. She wanted him to leak the information to TerraSave, to let them publicize what the government was hiding. Leon refused, arguing that doing so would compromise national security and potentially trigger international conflicts. They parted on tense terms, each convinced the other was making the wrong choice. Leon chose loyalty to his position over transparency, a decision that aligned with his orders but cost him personally in ways he'd spend years processing. Damnation, Eastern Slav Republic, 2011. 5 years later, Leon was dispatched to the Eastern Slav Republic, a war-torn nation in Eastern Europe where a civil war had been raging for years. Intelligence indicated that one faction was deploying bioweapons, specifically Las Plagas, and the U.S. government wanted confirmation before deciding how to respond to the conflict. Leon's orders were to infiltrate, assess the situation, and report back without engaging unless absolutely necessary. It was supposed to be a reconnaissance mission. The situation on the ground was worse than intelligence had suggested. The government forces, desperate to defeat rebel factions, had purchased plagas from black market arms dealers and were deploying them as shock troops. Infected soldiers fought with enhanced strength and coordination while retaining enough intelligence to use weapons and tactics, creating a military force that conventional armies couldn't match. The rebels were being systematically slaughtered, and civilian casualties were mounting as the government showed no restraint in deploying their bioweapons. Leon quickly determined that the situation required intervention beyond just intelligence gathering. The government's president, Alexander, was using bioweapons to commit what amounted to genocide against his own people, and international observers were being kept away through diplomatic manipulation. If someone didn't stop the bioweapon deployment, the entire conflict would escalate beyond containment, potentially spreading infection beyond the nation's borders. During his infiltration, Leon encountered Buddy, a rebel commander who'd been infected with a plaga but had maintained his free will through a complex symbiotic relationship with the parasite. Buddy represented something Leon had never seen before. Someone who'd been infected but retained their humanity, using the parasite's power without being controlled by it. The existence of such a state suggested the plagas were even more adaptable and dangerous than previous research had indicated. Leon and Buddy formed an uneasy alliance. Buddy wanted to protect his people and defeat the government forces that were destroying his country. Leon wanted to stop the bioweapon deployment and prevent international escalation. Their goals aligned temporarily, but Leon knew that eventually he'd need to deal with Buddy's infection, and that confrontation would test whether the bond they'd formed meant anything against the imperative to eliminate bioweapon threats. The mission escalated into full-scale combat as Leon fought alongside rebel forces to infiltrate the government's bioweapon facility. Ada Wong appeared again, working for some organization with interest in the Plagas and operating with her usual ambiguous loyalties. Her presence meant that even if Leon stopped the immediate deployment, samples would likely be secured and sold to whoever Ada was working for now. The futility of that reality exhausted Leon more than the physical combat. Inside the facility, Leon discovered the full scope of President Alexander's plans. He wasn't just using Plagas to win a civil war. He was creating a new military paradigm where bioweapon-enhanced soldiers would replace conventional forces. Alexander believed he was advancing military science, creating super soldiers who would give smaller nations the ability to defend themselves against superpowers. He saw himself as a visionary rather than a war criminal, unable or unwilling to acknowledge the horror he'd unleashed. Leon confronted Alexander as the facility began to collapse, government and rebel forces clashing throughout the complex. The president had infected himself with an advanced plaga, transforming into a massive bioweapon in a last attempt to prove his vision was correct. The battle was brutal, Leon fighting with the kind of weary determination that comes from having done this too many times before. He wasn't shocked or terrified by Alexander's transformation. He was just tired, going through the motions of destroying another person who thought they could control bioweapons and been proven catastrophically wrong. Alexander died, and Leon escaped the facility with Buddy, who was showing signs that his symbiotic relationship with the Plaga was breaking down. The parasite was slowly taking over despite Buddy's resistance, and Leon knew that the clock was ticking on when his ally would become another threat that needed to be eliminated. They reached the extraction point together, and Leon was faced with the decision: follow protocol and kill Buddy to eliminate the bioweapon threat, or let him live and risk the Plaga gaining full control. Leon chose mercy. He shot Buddy in a way that damaged the Plaga's connection to the nervous system without killing the host, essentially paralyzing the parasite's control functions. It was a temporary solution at best, and Buddy would spend the rest of his life with a dormant bioweapon in his body. But Leon couldn't bring himself to execute someone who'd helped save countless civilians. He justified the decision by noting that Buddy's unique symbiotic relationship with the Plaga made him a valuable research subject for developing countermeasures. But the truth was simpler. Leon was tired of killing people, even when they were infected. The aftermath of the Eastern Slav Republic mission brought official reprimand. Leon had exceeded his mission parameters, engaged in combat operations without authorization, and allowed an infected individual to survive. His superiors noted their disapproval in his file, but President Graham defended Leon's actions, pointing out that the bioweapon deployment had been stopped and valuable intelligence had been gathered. Leon kept his position but understood that his independence and willingness to make judgment calls in the field was becoming a problem for the bureaucratic structure he operated within. Resident Evil 6, Tall Oaks and Beyond, 2013. 2 years later, in 2013, Leon was back in the United States when the worst-case scenario that every anti-bioterror operative feared finally occurred: a major outbreak in an American city. Tall Oaks, where Ivy University was located, became ground zero for a new bioweapon called the C virus. The outbreak occurred during a public event where President Adam Benford was preparing to announce the truth about Raccoon City, finally revealing the government's involvement in the disaster and Umbrella's crimes. Leon was at the university that evening, having been invited by President Benford to attend the announcement. They'd developed a genuine friendship over the years, Benford being one of the few people in government who understood what Leon had experienced and sacrificed. The president believed that transparency about Raccoon City was necessary for preventing future incidents, that the culture of secrecy and cover-ups had enabled bioterrorism to proliferate. Leon supported the decision, even knowing it would likely end his own career once his role in various classified operations became public knowledge. The C virus outbreak destroyed those plans within minutes. The infection spread rapidly through the university, turning attendees into zombies faster than the T virus ever had. Leon watched Benford get infected, tried to protect him, and ultimately had to shoot his friend as the president transformed into one of the creatures. The weight of that act, killing the President of the United States because he'd become a bioweapon, would haunt Leon for years. It was Raccoon City all over again, except this time there was no excuse of being a rookie, no claim that he hadn't seen it coming. Leon partnered with Helena Harper, a Secret Service agent who'd been assigned to protect the president, and was devastated by their failure to prevent the outbreak. Helena harbored a secret. She'd been blackmailed into facilitating the attack by Derek Simmons, the national security advisor who'd orchestrated the C virus deployment. Her sister was being held hostage, and Simmons had threatened to kill her unless Helena provided access codes that disabled security systems at the university. She'd complied, choosing her sister over her duty, and now carried the guilt of having enabled the attack that killed the president and hundreds of others. Together, Leon and Helena fought through tall oaks as the infection spread beyond the university. The C virus created zombies that were faster and more aggressive than T virus strains, and it also generated unique mutations in some hosts, creating specialized bioweapons that hunted survivors with disturbing intelligence. The city was being evacuated using military protocols, but Leon and Helena knew that meant sterilization was coming. Just like Raccoon City, the government would erase tall oaks to contain the outbreak, and they needed to escape before that happened, while also gathering evidence about who was responsible. They discovered that Derek Simmons, the national security advisor, had orchestrated the attack to prevent President Benford from revealing the truth about Raccoon City. Simmons was part of an organization called the Family, a secret society that had been manipulating global events for generations. The Family believed that maintaining stability required controlling information, and Benford's planned disclosure threatened their carefully constructed order. Simmons had decided that killing the president and framing the attack as terrorism was preferable to allowing the truth to emerge. Leon and Helena escaped tall oaks just before a sterilization missile destroyed the city, killing any remaining survivors along with the infected. It was Raccoon City again, history repeating with the same brutal efficiency. Another American town erased from maps and memory to hide the failures of bioweapon containment. Leon had survived 2 such erasures now, and the psychological weight of watching entire cities die was becoming harder to carry. They pursued Simmons to Lanshan, China, where another outbreak was already underway. The C virus had been deployed simultaneously in multiple locations, part of a larger plan by Simmons and the Family to destabilize global security and justify increased authoritarian measures. China's coastal city of Lanshan was under siege, with C virus infections spreading through the population and new bioweapon variants emerging faster than military forces could respond. In Lanshan, Leon's path intersected with Chris Redfield, now a BSAA commander who'd been fighting bioterror threats through his own channels since leaving STARS. Chris was hunting someone he believed was Ada Wong, holding her responsible for attacks on his unit. The reunion between Leon and Chris was tense, both men exhausted and traumatized by years of fighting bioterror threats, both believing their approach was correct and the other's was misguided. The figure Chris was hunting turned out to be Carla Radames, a researcher Simmons had transformed into an Ada Wong clone using the C virus. Carla had been Simmons' obsession, a woman he'd loved who didn't return his feelings. So he'd used bioweapon technology to literally reshape her into the woman he did love, Ada Wong. The procedure had worked physically but destroyed Carla's personality, leaving her a twisted copy, seeking revenge against Simmons for what he'd done to her. She'd been orchestrating bioterror attacks under Ada's identity, framing the real Ada while pursuing her own vendetta. The real Ada Wong was also in Lanshan, working against Simmons and the family for her own reasons. She helped Leon and Chris understand the situation, provided intelligence about the family's operations, and ensured that Leon could reach Simmons for a final confrontation. Her motivations remained opaque as always, but her assistance was genuine, suggesting that whatever organization she worked for now opposed the family's methods. Leon and Helena confronted Simmons in a subway station as Lanshan descended into complete chaos above them. Simmons had been infected with the C virus in an attack by Carla's forces, and the virus was transforming him even as he tried to explain his actions. He genuinely believed he'd been protecting the nation, that preventing the truth about Raccoon City from emerging was worth the cost of tall oaks and Lanshan. His transformation mid-conversation was almost anticlimactic, the man becoming monster while still trying to justify his choices. The fight against mutated Simmons was exhausting rather than dramatic. Leon had fought so many of these transformed humans by this point that the shock was gone, replaced by grim efficiency. Simmons' mutations were extensive, the C virus giving him multiple forms, as Leon and Helena pursued him through the subway system and eventually to the city's surface. Each time they put him down, he regenerated, the virus refusing to let its host die until finally, after multiple encounters, Simmons' body could no longer sustain the continuous regeneration and he dissolved. In the aftermath, with Lanshan still burning and casualty counts in the thousands, Leon filed his report on Simmons and the family. The evidence he'd gathered was incontrovertible, but predictably, it would be classified and sealed. The family's other members would be dealt with quietly. Simmons would be officially listed as a victim of the attack rather than its architect, and the public would never know how close they'd come to the family's vision of controlled global catastrophe. Leon returned to the United States having killed the president he'd been protecting, watched another American city get destroyed, and gathered evidence that would never see public disclosure. The Raccoon City truth that President Benford had wanted to reveal remained classified. The cycle continued, bioterror attacks occurring, being contained at massive cost, and then being buried under official narratives that protected institutions rather than informed the public. The 6 years between Resident Evil 6 and Leon's next major operation were filled with smaller missions, ongoing operations against bioterror cells, and the slow accumulation of fatigue that comes from fighting a war that never ends. Leon continued as a government agent because he was good at the work and because someone needed to do it, but the idealism that had survived even Raccoon City was finally gone. He'd become what Jack Krauser had accused him of refusing to be, a pragmatic operator who understood that perfect solutions didn't exist and that sometimes you just tried to minimize the damage. Vendetta, New York Crisis, 2014. In 2014, Leon was dispatched to investigate an arms dealer named Glenn Arias, who'd been purchasing bioweapon research from various sources. Intelligence suggested Arias was preparing a large-scale attack, but his target and methods remained unclear. The mission brought Leon into contact with Chris Redfield again and Rebecca Chambers, the former STARS medic who now worked as a bioweapon researcher trying to develop countermeasures and vaccines. Glenn Arias was different from previous bioterror threats Leon had faced. He wasn't driven by profit like the Wilpharma researchers, or ideology like Los Illuminados, or political power like Derek Simmons. Arias was motivated by pure revenge. His wife had been killed in a U.S. drone strike during an anti-terror operation, her death dismissed as collateral damage by the government officials who'd ordered the strike. Arias had decided that if his loss meant nothing to those in power, he'd create loss on a scale they couldn't ignore. The virus Arias had developed was called the A virus, a strain that combined elements of Las Plagas with more traditional viral bioweapons. The result was a pathogen that could be controlled remotely, allowing Arias to infect large populations and then direct their behavior like puppets. His target was New York City, where he planned to release the A virus during a major public event and turn millions of people into a bioweapon army under his direct control. Leon, Chris, and Rebecca worked together to track Arias to his facility in Mexico, where he was finalizing preparations for the attack. The operation required infiltrating his compound, fighting through his private military forces and bioweapon test subjects, and stopping the virus release before Arias could deploy it to New York. The mission brought together 3 different approaches to fighting bioterrorism: Leon's government operations, Chris's BSAA military response, and Rebecca's scientific research. Their combined efforts represented perhaps the most coordinated anti-bioterror operation that had been attempted. The confrontation with Arias came in his facility's central laboratory, where he'd set up the virus distribution system. He'd already infected himself with a modified version of the A virus, giving him enhanced abilities while maintaining his intelligence and control. Unlike other bioweapon users who transformed into monsters, Arias remained essentially human in appearance, which made the fight more personal and more disturbing. This wasn't a creature Leon could dehumanize. It was a man who'd chosen to become a weapon. Arias nearly succeeded. The virus was released, and for several terrifying hours, portions of New York City experienced outbreaks as the A virus spread through localized populations. But Rebecca had developed a vaccine based on research she'd been conducting for years, and mass distribution through emergency medical channels prevented the outbreak from becoming catastrophic. Leon and Chris destroyed Arias and his distribution network, and New York was saved, though not without casualties. The Vendetta operation was notable for being one of the few times that a bioterror attack was stopped before reaching full catastrophic scale. Casualties numbered in dozens rather than thousands. The virus was contained before spreading beyond initial infection zones, and the public never fully understood how close they'd come to disaster. For Leon, it represented a rare operational success, proof that with proper coordination and intelligence, bioterror threats could be stopped before they destroyed entire cities. But even that success came with costs. Leon's personal life, such as it was, continued to deteriorate. The mission had brought him back into direct contact with people who knew him from earlier operations, and they all noted the changes. Leon Kennedy in 2014 was harder, more cynical, more likely to make ruthless decisions if they achieved mission objectives. The rookie cop who'd wanted to help people had been burned away by years of watching people die despite his best efforts. The Later Years and Death Island, 2015. By 2015, Leon had been fighting bioterrorism for 17 years. He'd participated in dozens of operations, killed thousands of infected individuals, destroyed multiple bioweapon research facilities, and gathered enough classified intelligence to fill a small library. He'd become one of the most experienced anti-bioterror operatives in the world, and that experience had cost him nearly everything else. He had no real personal relationships outside his work, no family, no permanent home, no hobbies or interests that weren't connected to his mission. Leon Kennedy had become his job completely. The Death Island incident brought together multiple threads of Leon's history when a new bioterror attack targeted Alcatraz Island in San Francisco Bay. The island, which had been converted into a tourist attraction, was hit with a bioweapon release that transformed visitors and staff into aggressive infected. The attack was traced to an individual seeking revenge against several specific BSAA and government operatives, including Leon, Chris, and others who'd been involved in anti-bioterror operations over the years. The perpetrator behind Death Island was Dylan Blake, a former Los Angeles SWAT officer whose family had been killed in a bioterror incident that Leon and others had responded to years earlier. Blake blamed the operatives for not saving his family, for prioritizing containment over rescue, for all the brutal calculations that anti-bioterror work required. His revenge plot involved infecting the island and luring Leon, Chris, Jill Valentine, and Claire Redfield to the location so they could experience the same helplessness he'd felt watching his family die. The Death Island operation forced Leon to confront the accumulated costs of his career. Blake's accusations weren't entirely wrong. There had been missions where Leon prioritized containment over rescue, where he'd made decisions that saved more lives overall, but condemned specific individuals to death. Those decisions had been necessary, but they'd also created victims beyond just those who'd been infected. Blake represented all the family members, friends, and survivors who'd lost people because of choices Leon and others had made in the field. Leon, Chris, Claire, and Jill worked together to stop Blake's revenge plot and contain the outbreak on Alcatraz. The coordination between them demonstrated how much experience they'd accumulated over the years, how efficiently they could respond to bioterror incidents, and how deeply their lives had been shaped by this continuous war. They saved the tourists on the island, prevented the virus from spreading to San Francisco, and stopped Blake before he could execute the full scope of his revenge. But the victory felt hollow. Blake was right that their work created collateral damage, that containment protocols prioritized limiting spread over rescuing everyone in the infection zone, that the mathematics of bioterror response were brutal and unforgiving. Leon couldn't deny those truths, and he couldn't offer Blake anything except the cold reality that there were no better options. The conversation between them, before Blake's final transformation and death, was one of the most difficult Leon had experienced, because there was no way to defend choices that were simultaneously necessary and monstrous. After Death Island, Leon continued his work, but with growing awareness that the war he'd been fighting since 1998 had no victory condition. Bioterrorism wasn't a problem that could be solved, just a threat that required constant vigilance. Every organization they destroyed was replaced by someone else who'd acquired bioweapon samples and decided to use them. Every vaccine developed led to new viral strains that evaded it. Every containment protocol refined just meant the next outbreak would be slightly more controlled, but never fully prevented. The endless war, Leon Kennedy's story, doesn't have an ending, at least not one that's been written yet. As of the most recent reports, he continues to operate as one of the U.S. government's most valuable assets in the fight against bioterrorism. His missions remain largely classified, his successes unacknowledged publicly, and his failures buried under national security protocols. The rookie cop who drove into Raccoon City wanting to help people has become a weapon pointed at threats most civilians don't know exist. The psychological cost of that transformation is something Leon rarely discusses but constantly carries. He's developed mechanisms for dealing with the trauma, compartmentalization, dark humor, focusing on immediate objectives rather than larger questions about meaning or justice. But occasionally, in quiet moments between missions, the weight becomes visible. Leon Kennedy has seen more death than anyone should witness, has killed more infected humans than he can count, and has participated in cover-ups that protected institutions rather than revealed truth. His relationships with other long-term survivors of bioterror incidents, Chris, Claire, Jill, Rebecca, provide some emotional support, but they're all fighting their own battles with the same trauma. They understand each other in ways that normal people can't, but that shared understanding is built on shared horror. The bonds between them are strong, but not necessarily healthy, more like fellow soldiers in an endless war than friends who can help each other heal. Leon's relationship with Ada Wong remains complicated and unresolved. She appears periodically in his missions, sometimes helping and sometimes working at cross purposes, always operating with motivations that remain opaque. There's clearly history and emotion between them, but it's buried under layers of professional distance and the reality that they serve different masters. Leon knows Ada has helped him survive multiple encounters, but he also knows she's stolen bioweapon samples that have likely been used in other attacks. The moral complexity of that relationship mirrors the moral complexity of Leon's entire career. The question of whether Leon's work matters, whether the sacrifices have been worth it, is one he likely asks himself in darker moments. The optimistic answer is that his efforts have prevented countless deaths, that without operatives like him, bioterror attacks would be far more frequent and devastating. The pessimistic answer is that his work has only delayed inevitable catastrophes while providing cover for systems that enabled bioweapon development in the first place. The truth probably lies somewhere between those extremes, in the messy reality where preventing one disaster creates conditions for the next. What's certain is that Leon Kennedy can't stop. He's too experienced, too skilled, and too deeply committed to walk away while bioterror threats continue emerging. The government knows he's valuable and will continue deploying him until he either dies in the field or becomes too damaged to function effectively. There's no retirement plan for people with Leon's knowledge and capabilities, no quiet ending where he settles down and tries to build a normal life. The work will continue until it kills him, or until bioterrorism somehow ends, and the latter seems far less likely than the former. Reflections on a life defined by crisis. If you were to ask Leon what he's learned from 17 years of fighting bioterrorism, he might tell you that bioweapons represent humanity's greatest failure of imagination and ethics. Every virus, every parasite, every biological weapon he's encountered was created by someone who believed they could control it, that they could limit its effects to designated targets, that the power it represented was worth the risks. And every single one of them was wrong. He's learned that corporations will prioritize profit over safety until forced to do otherwise. He's learned that governments will cover up disasters to protect their legitimacy, even when transparency might prevent future incidents. He's learned that desperate people make terrible decisions, that revenge is a powerful motivator, and that the line between protecting people and becoming the threat you're fighting against is thinner than anyone wants to acknowledge. He's learned that some people can't be saved, that containment sometimes requires sacrificing those who might be rescued, and that the calculus of bioterror response is brutal enough to break anyone who thinks too carefully about the implications. He's learned that surviving doesn't make you a hero, that doing your job well doesn't make you a good person, and that the distinction between being a protector and being a weapon is mostly about who's giving the orders. But he's also learned that some things matter, even when the situation is hopeless. Sherry Birkin survived and grew up because Leon refused to let her be treated as just a research subject. Ashley Graham returned to her father because Leon prioritized her rescue over his own safety. Countless civilians have lived because Leon and others like him stepped between them and bioweapon threats. Those individual successes don't undo the larger failures, but they're not nothing either. Leon Kennedy is a man haunted by the weight of impossible choices and sustained by the belief that making those choices is better than refusing to engage. He's not particularly happy, not at peace with what he's done, and not convinced that his efforts have made the world significantly better. But he continues because someone has to, because the alternative is allowing bioterror threats to proliferate unchecked, and because the rookie cop who wanted to help people never completely died despite everything that's tried to kill him. His story is one of gradual erosion and stubborn persistence, of idealism ground down by reality but never quite extinguished, of a person who became a weapon but retained enough humanity to understand what that transformation cost. Leon Kennedy represents what happens when good intentions meet impossible circumstances repeatedly over decades, when doing the right thing requires becoming someone you wouldn't recognize if you met your younger self. The continuing threat, as of the most current intelligence reports, bioterrorism remains a persistent global threat. The destruction of Umbrella Corporation didn't end bioweapon development, it merely decentralized it. Former Umbrella researchers sold their knowledge and samples to various organizations, criminal groups, terrorist cells, and even legitimate pharmaceutical companies interested in the potential applications. The T virus, G virus, Las Plagas, C virus, and dozens of other strains continue to surface in black market transactions and outbreak investigations. Leon's work, like that of his colleagues in the BSAA and other anti-bioterror organizations, has shifted from fighting a single corporate threat to managing a distributed network of smaller threats. It's a less dramatic but more exhausting model of warfare, requiring constant vigilance rather than decisive victories. Every lab that's shut down is replaced by 2 more in different locations. Every researcher arrested or killed has students who've learned their techniques. Every virus strain that's cataloged and countered mutates into something that requires new countermeasures. The geopolitical implications of bioweapon proliferation continue to shape international relations in ways that most civilians don't see. Nations maintain their own bioweapon development programs while publicly condemning bioterrorism, creating a hypocritical dynamic that makes comprehensive solutions impossible. The same governments that employ operatives like Leon to stop bioterror attacks also maintain strategic reserves of biological weapons for deterrence purposes, ensuring that the knowledge and capability to create new outbreaks will never be fully eliminated. Leon understands these larger patterns but focuses on the immediate mission because contemplating the systemic issues leads to paralysis. He can't solve geopolitical problems or change how nations approach biological warfare. He can respond to specific threats, protect specific people, and prevent specific outbreaks. Those limited objectives are achievable, which makes them sustainable. The moment he starts thinking about winning the overall war rather than individual battles, the futility becomes overwhelming. The younger generation of anti-bioterror operatives look at veterans like Leon with a mixture of respect and concern. They recognize his competence and experience, but they also see the toll that 17 years of this work has taken. Leon represents what they'll become if they survive long enough, and for many of them that's not an encouraging vision. Some quit after their first major operation, deciding that the psychological costs are too high. Others commit fully and begin their own transformation into weapons. Leon doesn't offer much advice to newer operatives beyond tactical guidance. He's not a mentor figure who's found wisdom and experience. He's someone who survived through capability and stubbornness. When pressed, he might tell them to hold on to whatever personal connections they can maintain, to not let the work consume everything, to remember that the infected they're fighting were people before the virus. But he knows they probably won't follow that advice, just as he didn't when he was starting out, because the nature of the work makes those boundaries impossible to maintain. Legacy of the Raccoon City survivor. Leon Kennedy's identity remains tied to Raccoon City, despite everything that's happened since. He's one of the most prominent survivors of that disaster, someone whose first day as a police officer became a nightmare that defined his entire life. The irony isn't lost on him. He'd been hours late to work because of a hangover caused by relationship troubles, and that poor decision saved his life, while officers who'd arrived on time died. There's no way to reconcile the guilt of surviving through failure with the gratitude of being alive. The other Raccoon City survivors, Claire, Sherry, and the handful of others who made it out, share a bond that outsiders can't fully understand. They experience something that the rest of the world can't imagine because the official story has been sanitized and classified. They know what it's like to watch an entire city die, to be surrounded by the infected, to understand that no help is coming and that survival depends entirely on your own capabilities. That shared knowledge creates connection but also isolation, because it's not something you can explain to people who weren't there. Leon occasionally wonders what his life would have been like if he'd arrived in Raccoon City on time, if he'd reported for his shift before the outbreak reached critical mass. Most likely he'd have died with the rest of the police department, just another name on the list of casualties. But there's a small chance he might have helped contain the outbreak earlier, that his presence could have changed outcomes for others. That speculation is pointless but inevitable, the kind of counterfactual thinking that comes from being a survivor. The official narrative about Raccoon City remains a sanitized version that attributes the disaster to a gas leak and subsequent containment efforts. The public doesn't know about Umbrella's bioweapon research, the T-virus outbreak, or the deliberate decision to sterilize the city with a nuclear weapon. Leon participated in maintaining that lie for years, following orders to protect classified information. President Benford's attempt to reveal the truth died with him in tall oaks, and subsequent administrations have shown no interest in reopening that particular wound. Living with that lie has been part of the cost of Leon's career. He knows what really happened, knows that the public deserves to understand the threats that still exist, but he's chosen operational effectiveness over transparency. The classified work he does requires security clearance and government support that would disappear if he went public with what he knows. So he maintains the lie, tells himself it's necessary for the greater good, and tries not to think too carefully about whether that justification holds up under scrutiny. The personal cost, Beyond the obvious trauma and psychological damage, Leon's career has cost him the possibility of a normal life. He's never married, never had children, never established roots anywhere. His living situation is temporary by design, knowing that his next mission could deploy him anywhere in the world with minimal notice. The few personal possessions he maintains are portable and easily abandoned if necessary. He's built a life around the assumption that attachment is vulnerability. Romantic relationships have been particularly complicated. The nature of his work makes trust difficult, and the classified aspects make genuine intimacy nearly impossible. He can't talk about what he does, where he goes, or what he's experienced with anyone who doesn't have equivalent clearance and context. That eliminates most potential partners, leaving only others in the anti-bioterror community who understand the work but are fighting their own battles with the same trauma. His relationship with Ada Wong represents the closest thing to a sustained, romantic connection in his life, but it's built on mutual attraction complicated by professional opposition and personal secrets. They've saved each other's lives multiple times, worked together on missions, and clearly care about each other, but Ada's loyalties remain divided and her ultimate motivations opaque. Leon has never been able to fully trust her, and she's never been willing to give him the transparency that trust would require. The friendship networks that sustain most people are absent from Leon's life. His closest relationships are with other bioterror survivors who understand his experiences but aren't necessarily healthy support systems. Chris Redfield is a colleague and occasionally an ally, but they approach their work differently and have different philosophies about what they're trying to achieve. Claire Redfield is someone Leon genuinely cares about, but their paths diverged years ago, and they rarely interact outside of crisis situations. The connections exist but aren't deep enough to provide real emotional support. Physical health has also deteriorated over years of combat operations. Leon carries injuries from dozens of encounters, some treated properly, and others handled with field medicine that kept him functional without fully healing the damage. His body shows the accumulated wear of 17 years fighting bioweapons, and he's aware that his physical capabilities are beginning to decline as he ages. The work requires peak performance, and there's no good answer for what happens when he can no longer deliver it. What remains? Despite everything that's been lost, ground down, or destroyed by years of fighting bioterrorism, something essential remains in Leon Kennedy that hasn't been completely corrupted. He still makes choices in the field that prioritize protecting civilians over operational efficiency. He still questions orders when they seem wrong, still pushes back against protocols that treat people as acceptable casualties. That core of idealism that drew him to police work in the first place survived Raccoon City, Operation Javier, the Spanish Village, Tall Oaks, and everything else that should have killed it. Maybe it's stubbornness, or maybe it's the only way Leon knows how to maintain his humanity while doing inhuman work. He can't save everyone, can't prevent every outbreak, can't stop bioterrorism from continuing to emerge as a threat, but he can make choices in specific moments that reflect the values he wanted to embody when he first became a cop. Those small choices don't undo the larger compromises, but there's something to hold on to when the weight of everything else becomes crushing. The rookie cop who drove into Raccoon City on September 29th, 1998, wanted to help people and make a difference. The government agent that rookie became has helped people and made a difference, just not in the way he imagined. The cost has been almost everything he was and most of what he might have become. What remains is someone defined entirely by crisis, shaped by trauma, and sustained by the belief that the work still matters, even when it feels hopeless. Leon Kennedy's story is about the distance between who you want to be and who circumstances force you to become, measured in years of accumulated horror and impossible choices. It's about fighting a war that can't be won while refusing to surrender, because surrender means letting threats proliferate unchecked. It's about maintaining humanity while doing work that strips away almost everything that makes you human. And it's about surviving long enough to wonder whether survival was the victory you thought it would be when you were younger and the world seemed simpler. The work continues, the threats evolve, the missions accumulate, and Leon Kennedy, now approaching 40 years old, remains one of the government's most effective weapons against bioterrorism. He's not the person he was, not even close, but he's exactly who this moment in history needs him to be. Whether that represents success or tragedy depends on how you measure the worth of a life spent fighting monsters while trying not to become one yourself. The story of Leon Kennedy is the story of every person who's had to choose between personal ideals and practical necessity, who's been ground down by impossible circumstances but kept going anyway, who sacrificed their own well-being for abstract concepts like duty and protection. It's not a happy story, and it doesn't have a satisfying resolution because the problems Leon fights against don't have satisfying resolutions. Bioterrorism will continue, the work will continue, and Leon Kennedy will continue until something finally stops him, whether that's a bioweapon that proves too powerful, a mission that pushes him past his breaking point, or simply age and accumulated damage rendering him ineffective. For now, he remains operational. The nightmares are manageable. The missions are survivable. The cost is acceptable, or at least has been accepted because there's no way to unpay it. Leon Kennedy stands as a monument to what happens when good intentions meet evil circumstance repeatedly over decades, not destroyed, not unchanged, but transformed into something that serves a purpose, even if that purpose has cost almost everything else.